So after Jesus raises this young man from death, the very next part in the story in Luke, which continues right on because it says, the disciples showed him all these things that he had just done, raising him from the dead. And John sent his two disciples to ask Jesus, saying, "Are you he?" So it seems as if this questioning by John the Baptist of Jesus happens immediately after this story. But in Matthew, this story doesn't happen until chapter 11. However, I already know that Matthew is jumbled around. He's hitting the highlights. He's explaining the important things, not necessarily in order. So I'm going to go with the order of Luke. The other question is that the very first verse of Matthew 11 says, "And it came to pass when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in other cities. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent two of his disciples." So that doesn't seem to make sense because, like I said earlier, it seems as though this questioning of Jesus by John the Baptist through his disciples happens right after this event. Not days or weeks later when Jesus is preaching among other cities. Chapter 11 verse 1 says, "When he had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples," when he had finished with what he was just saying in the chapter before. In the chapter before is him sending his disciples to preach on their own, sending them 2 by 2, giving them the power to cast out devils and to heal and to cleanse lepers. Freely you have received, freely give. This is Matthew chapter 10. From Mark and Luke, we see that that event happens later. So this verse in the beginning of chapter 11 could be added right at the end of that story, that Jesus sent forth his 12 disciples to preach, and while they're preaching, he went elsewhere to preach on his own. So that can be kept as one story, one event, with the first verse of chapter 11. And then starting in verse 2 in chapter 11 would be what is combined with Luke, that John the Baptist sends his disciples. So then beginning in Matthew 11:2, it says, "Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, 'Are you he that should come?'" In Luke, it's a bit more descriptive. It says, "And the disciples of John showed him all these things. And John, calling to him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, 'Are you he that should come?'" In Matthew, it just says John heard about it and sent his disciples. In Luke, it says the disciples told him, and that's how he heard. And then he sends his 2 disciples to ask Jesus. So I'm going to have the beginning be from Luke. "And the disciples of John showed him all these things." Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ. So the disciples of John showed him, but Matthew, it says, when John heard in the prison the works of Christ. Maybe I could say, "And the disciples of John showed him in the prison the works of Christ," and then I could say, "Now when John heard all these things, he called to him 2 of his disciples." Yeah, so it could be like they showed him the works of Christ, and when John had heard it all, then he sent it. That'd kind of be rearranging these verses though, because it says in Matthew, "When John had heard in the prison the works of Christ," and I'd be saying when he was shown in the prison and had heard from being from before, earlier in that same verse, as in the prison. "And the disciples of John showed him all these things." See, I don't want to say they showed him all these things and then he heard in the prison, because I need to mention that he's in the prison first to set up the situation, to show the setting. You don't say he was in the prison at the end of the scene. You set up the scene first. But that means I'd have to say that he heard after the mention of him being in prison, which is reversed, because in Matthew it says he heard in the prison the works of Christ. But he's hearing from his disciples. And I want to put the fact that they're telling him all these things before I say he heard. Because I don't want to say that he heard them and then say the disciples are telling him. No, they're telling him and he heard. That's the order. They tell him first. He hears in the process of them telling him. So you have to say they're telling him first. I don't want to have to reorganize Matthew 11:2, but I think I might have to, just to have it make sense. It'll be pretty much the order of Luke. The disciples of John showed him, and then I'll stop. I'll save all these things for last. And then I'll go into Matthew, midway through the verse, in the prison, the works of Christ. Then I'll go back to the beginning of this same verse. Now when John had heard, back over to Luke, all these things, he asked for 2 of his disciples. Yeah. It is switching around the beginning portion of Matthew 2 and the middle portion of Matthew 2, which I don't enjoy doing, but I think I have to just to have it make sense. Like I said, you can't have it being mentioned that he's in prison after the disciples come to him and explain to him everything, and after John heard all of it. You got to say that they told him all this to John in prison. And when John heard all these things, he sent for his disciples. It's not changing the meaning of the verse. I'm just having it make more sense because it's a mix from Matthew and Luke. So let's see what it looks like. Starting from Luke, and the disciples of John showed him, should I say, showed him of the works of Christ? And then later on, when John had heard all these things? Or should I say, the disciples of John showed him straight to the works of Christ. And then later on, now when John had heard of all these things. No, because saying he heard of all these things would make it sound like he's hearing from general news. But if I say they told John of the works of Christ, now when he heard these things, it's more direct. They're telling him of all the works. That could be general, and then he's hearing it directly from them. So no of in that situation. Okay, so they showed him of right here. Now over to Matthew. In the prison. Oh wait, no, first I can't put of yet. Showed him in the prison of the works of Christ. Yeah, that should work. Luke just showed him all these things. So all these things, like I said, I'm saving for later. The works of Christ, and now I need to go back to the beginning of Matthew. Now when John had heard, and then to Luke, all these things, he called 2 disciples to go to question Jesus. I don't really like reorganizing that beginning part of Matthew to come later, but it makes so much more sense to say that he was told first, and now that he heard it, he's sending his disciples to question them. I mean, imagine it the other way. If I had said, when John had heard these things, and the disciples had showed him the works of Christ, he sent his 2 disciples. That would mean that he's hearing from other sources, not just the disciples. And you could sort of get that from Matthew, but Luke is very clear. The disciples showed him these things, and John sent his disciples to question Jesus. So it's clear. He's hearing from his disciples what Jesus is doing, and that's why he's questioning Jesus, not because he's just hearing from all about. Well, I don't know. Maybe it would work. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, and the disciples of John showed him of all these things. No, see, that doesn't work because the very next verse in Luke continues with, and John calling to him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus. It would have to be when they had showed him all these things, he called, because going from showed, well, that's how it is in Luke. They showed him all these things, and John calling to him 2 of his disciples. It's already messed up. past, present. I'm rethinking all this. I think I might just have all that verse in Matthew just before he sent. Then Luke. John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, and the disciples of John showed him all these things. So it'd be both. He heard and the disciples showed him. So it could be that John the Baptist is receiving information from different sources, his disciples and others, which is pretty much how it's said between Matthew and Luke. Yeah, I'll go with that. Just so that I'm not changing anything, because I don't want to change anything. And it's possible to have this without changing anything, so I'll do it. It'll sound weird. I'm telling you it's going to sound weird, but we'll see. So starting with Matthew. Now, and John had heard in the prison the works of Christ. Stop there. I'm going to save the last bit of that verse. He sent two of his disciples until later. Switching over to Luke. And the disciples of John showed him of all these things. See, this is a problem because I really wanted to have John called to him two of his disciples and sent them to Jesus. It's because of what is just being written. Now, when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, and the disciples of John showed him all these things, he called. Now that he heard that, he's doing this. It doesn't make any sense to say, now that he heard and they showed him, and calling his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, "Are you sent?" Alright, I'm just going to keep going. I'll put the comma that is at the end of the first sentence in Matthew. I'll put that at the end here. That way there is at least a break. Now back to Luke. And John, calling to him two of his disciples, sent them to Jesus. But I'd have to say from Matthew, he sent two of his disciples. The fact that the word calling is written like that instead of called, past tense, means it's not going to make sense. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, and the disciples of John showed him all these things, and John calling to him two of his disciples sent them to Jesus. It doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. I'm thinking of going back to how I had it before. And the disciples of John showed him in the prison the works of Christ. Showed him of the works of Christ. Now when John had heard all these things, and calling to him two of his disciples. Yeah. Now when John had heard all these things, and calling to him two of his disciples, he sent them to Jesus. That fits a lot better. Yeah, that does fit. If I have it the way I was thinking at first. So that this, and John calling to him two of his disciples, is not part of the entirety of what was mentioned before. John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, and the disciples of John showed him all these things, and calling to him two of his disciples sent them to Jesus. No, that's a run-on. That's annoying. So I'm going to go back. Yeah, I'm going to go back to what it was before. And the disciples of John showed him in the prison of the works of Christ. And now when John had heard all these things, if I could say he heard these things. When John had heard all these things, no, this doesn't work. Heard all these things. I need another comma. This is tough. You know what the problem is? It doesn't make sense as it's written in Luke. This is the problem. Starting at verse 18, and the disciples of John showed him all these things. And then it goes right into John calling to him two of his disciples, sent them to Jesus. Why is he calling two of his disciples if they're already there talking to him? If they're already there showing him the works of Christ? Showing him all these things. So they show up, and then he's going to call from them directly in front of him two and send them to Jesus. It could just say he sent two to Jesus. The disciples of John showed him in the prison of the works of Christ. And now when John had heard all these things, it doesn't make any sense